Third section. Is watching South Park morally obligatory? You have a moral requirement to watch South Park? Okay. It's not obligatory. You don't have to watch. But what I will argue is that watching South Park helps one fulfill one's moral obligations. What moral obligations, you ask? Great question. I'm glad you asked. All right. Truth, specifically having true beliefs, is intrinsically valuable. In fact, as most philosophers argue, we are morally bound to seek the truth. Socrates taught us through Plato that truth must be sought at all costs, even your own death. Socrates is willing to die for it. But the pursuit of truth requires an open mind. An open mind is many things. For one, an open mind is one that will not base its beliefs on preference, interest, comfort, or convenience. My critical thinking students should know that. But most importantly, an open mind is one that is willing to question everything. The majority's opinion, one's political party, one's own beliefs, everything. As the manatees that write Family Guy might demand, nothing is off limits. And the pursuit of truth requires that we seek truth, even when it's hard to find. And this means seeking the truth on even issues in which the truth is hard to find, like abortion, stem cell research, euthanasia, just war theory, terrorism, the existence of God, religious doctrines like creationism and religious pluralism. And this is just what South Park does, and what watching it helps us do. Not only does South Park tackle nearly every difficult and controversial issue, but it does so in a completely open-minded way. Nothing is off limits for Matt and Trey. They question and make fun of everyone, the conservative, the liberal, the religious, the atheist, and everyone in between. And those who watch it, at least those who watch it correctly, are encouraged and engaged in all the important issues in a rigorous way. So in short, since we have a moral duty to seek truth in an open-minded way, and watching South Park can help us do just that, watching South Park can help us fulfill our moral obligations. Now, some of you may not be convinced, and I imagine this is because some of you don't know that South Park does this. And this is because, well, first of all, not everybody watches South Park, but worse, many people watch South Park, but they don't do it in the right kind of way. They watch it for its toilet humor, thus numbing their minds and missing the intellectual exercise that nearly every episode provides. So to convince you, let me describe to you how those who watch it wrong watch South Park, and also describe what they're missing when they do so. Such people, when they watch Cartman Land from season 5, just laugh at the fact that Kyle received a deadly hemorrhoid after Cartman inherited $1 million and bought his own amusement park. But they fail to recognize that those two events caused Kyle to lose his faith in God. God would never allow something that good to happen to someone as bad as Cartman, Kyle reasons, while allowing one of his faithful servants, like Kyle, to receive a hemorrhoid. Kyle, the entire episode, struggles with the philosophical problem of evil. And in the end, a solution to the problem of evil, and thus an argument for God's existence, is actually provided. If you just laughed at the hemorrhoid, you missed the point. And if you want to see more on this, chapter 19, that's my chapter. Such people, when they watch The Death Camp of Tolerance, only laugh at Mr. Garrison and Mr. Slave's, how should I say this? They only laugh at their gerbil abuse. They fail to recognize the message of the entire show, which is that the politically correct call for tolerance of others has perverted in a demand of acceptance of others. Tolerance of others, which is morally required, does not entail approval, which is not morally required. As Mr. Garrison says upon, through his amazement, receiving a medal for participating in homosexual behavior in front of his 4th graders, he says, "Look, this kind of behavior should not be acceptable from a teacher. Just because you have to tolerate something doesn't mean you have to approve of it. If you had to like it, it'd be called acceptance. Tolerate means you're putting up with it. You tolerate a crying child on the plane next to you, or you tolerate a bad cold. It can still piss you off." When such people watch Best Friends Forever from season 9, they only laugh at the fact that Cartman wants Kenny dead because Kenny left him his PSP in his will, and he wants a PSP, and they ran out of the store. But they fail to recognize that the entire story is an analogy for the Terry Schiavo case. And Matt and Trey were telling us that, regardless of what was right or wrong to do in regards to Terry Schiavo's feeding tube, we all did something wrong when we made a public spectacle out of her. Does everybody remember Terry Schiavo, right? The euthanasia case, where everybody was fighting to keep her on the feeding tube, right? Kenny was in the same situation. As Kenny wrote in his will, as he defined his wishes regarding what is to be done with him if he ever be in a persistent vegetative state, and I quote from Kenny's will, "If I should ever be in a vegetative state and kept alive on life support, please, for the love of God, don't ever show me in that condition on national television." We all did Terry Schiavo wrong, regardless of what we should have done with the feeding tube, when we made a public spectacle of it. When they watched Go God Go from season 10, they only laugh at Richard Dworkin's and Mrs. Garrison's semi-gay cartoon sex scene. They fail to recognize that Matt and Trey are preaching a lesson to those, like Dworkin, who think that eliminating religion will eliminate violence. In the episode, Cartman travels to the future, where religion has been replaced by science. Everybody says, "Oh my science," instead of "Oh my God." And alliances of atheists wage war over what the best name for an alliance of atheists should be. When such people watch Cartoon Wars, they only laugh at the fact that Matt and Trey make fun of their rival adult cartoon show, Family Guy. They think all the humor is just pointless throwbacks to the 80s. They happen to be slightly right about that. Family Guy's still funny. But when people only recognize that, they fail to recognize that Matt and Trey were telling us all that when people threaten to prevent us from saying certain things with violence, they are repressing freedom of speech. If we believe in freedom of speech, we should stand up for it by saying all the more what the people who are threatening violence don't want us to say. As Tweet Father said, when the townspeople decide to bury their heads in sand while Family Guy depicted the Prophet Muhammad as a cartoon, and I quote, "Wait a minute. What we need to do is the exact opposite. Freedom of speech is at stake here. Don't you all see? If anything, we should all make cartoons of Muhammad and show the terrorists and the extremists that we're all united in the belief that every person has a right to say what they want. Look, people, it's real easy for us to stand up for free speech lately. For the past few decades, we haven't had to risk anything to defend it. But those times are going to come. And one of those times is right now. And if we aren't willing to risk what we have, then we just believe in free speech, but we don't defend it. Such people fail to recognize that Matt and Trey were telling us that when people threaten when they threaten violence to get what they want, if we give in to them, in other words, when we give in to terrorism, we're just encouraging more terrorism by making terrorism work. As Kyle said to Doug, who happens to share the name with Comedy Central's president, you have to show Muhammad, Mr. President. And as for a background, this is an episode in which Matt and Trey really were going to depict Muhammad as a cartoon, and there was an issue about whether they were going to show it. And in the show, Family Guy was going to do the same thing. And so Kyle appeals to the president of Fox, who happens to be named Doug, just like the president of Comedy Central does. And he says, you have to show Muhammad, Mr. President. Just think about what you're doing to free speech. You can't do what Cartman wants just because he's the one that's threatening violence. Yes, people can get hurt. That's how terrorism works. But if you give in to that, Doug, you're allowing terrorism to work. If you don't show Muhammad, you've made a distinction between what's okay to poke fun at and what isn't. It's either all okay or none of it is. If we watch South Park, we must watch it in this way. And if you think you need help doing so, help is not far off. Every chapter of Arp's book is written by someone who watches South Park this way and examines its lessons thoroughly. After reading the book, the lessons of South Park will stick out like a sore thumb.